3 feet. That was all it was. 3 feet between 11-month-old Alara and the man they called the Iron Crown, and every armed guard in that hallway stopped breathing. No footsteps, no radio crackle, no whispered commands, and even the hum of the surveillance cameras seemed to die. Brielle's heart seized as she watched her baby's tiny hands press against the cold marble floor, chubby knees pushing forward with that fearless determination only children have. But what truly made Brielle's blood run cold wasn't her daughter. It was his posture. Asher Kane hadn't moved. His scarred knuckles still rested on the conference table. But his eyes, those eyes that had made grown men beg, had shifted down to track every inch of Alara's crawl. The strange thing was that he hadn't called for the guards, and that thought terrified her even more. Asher didn't speak. No shouting, no orders, nothing at all. Only that cold, unreadable gaze locked on the child moving toward him as if she were the only person in the building, as if he were trying to decode something he'd never been taught. Brielle's mind raced. You know that feeling when you realize your one mistake has just exposed you to something far more dangerous than being fired? When everything you've been hiding, every desperate lie, every stolen moment, is seconds from unraveling? That was what crashed over her. Behind her, one of the junior cleaners whispered in horror, "Is that a baby?" Then came the sound of holsters unclasping. Multiple weapons. Perfect. Now she was caught. The desperate gamble she'd been running for months, bringing her daughter to work, hidden in supply closets, tucked beneath a false bottom in her cleaning cart, had just blown apart exactly the way she'd always feared. But here's what those guards didn't know. The man whose attention little Alara had just captured wasn't going to react the way anyone in that mansion expected. And trust me, Brielle's entire world is about to transform in ways that will shock everyone inside those walls. But before we get there, if you enjoy stories about unlikely families, impossible choices, and the kind of love that changes everything, hit that like button, share this with someone who needs it, and subscribe so you never miss a story. Let me paint you the full picture of how a single mother and her fearless baby ended up in the most dangerous mansion in New York. Brielle's story didn't begin in that hallway. It began 6 months earlier, in a cheap rented room on the outskirts of the city, where she sat on an ice-cold floor, holding Alara to her chest and trying to swallow the fear that was crushing her throat. 6 months earlier, Brielle had run, not from a place, but from a person. A man who had taken everything she had, every saved dollar, every promise, every dream, and then vanished as if he'd never existed at all, leaving her alone with a 5-month belly and nothing but collapse. Brielle had no one to go back to. Her mother died when she was 13, on a winter morning, when the hospital called and the world changed forever. Her father, a Romanian man she remembered only by the smell of cigarettes and the slam of a door, had left even before that. Her grandmother in Ohio took her in, the only woman in this world who loved her without conditions. But she left too, exactly 3 weeks before Alara was born, as if the universe wanted to make sure Brielle would be completely alone when she stepped into motherhood. And she was alone. 27 years old, no family, no valid papers, no money, no future, only a newborn who needed her to live. So Brielle came to New York, because that's where people go when there's nowhere else left to go. The job at the Kane mansion came through whispers and desperation. A friend of someone knew someone who needed a cleaner. That was how everything worked when you had no papers. You didn't apply online. You didn't negotiate. You didn't ask questions. You took the job, and you prayed no one looked too closely. On the first day, Mrs. Hargrove, the head housekeeper with eyes sharp as knives, made everything Brielle needed to know perfectly clear. She tells you what you do. You clean. You stay quiet. You never go above the 4th floor. Mr. Kane didn't like seeing staff. If he saw you, you'd be fired. Brielle nodded. She was good at being invisible. She'd been invisible her whole life. But there was one problem she couldn't solve. Alara, childcare cost more than Brielle made in a week. The other cleaners would report her immediately if they saw a baby. Too much risk, too much noise, and leaving Alara alone in a rented room across the city wasn't even an option. So Brielle did what desperate mothers always do. She got creative. And for 2.5 months, that creativity kept them both alive. Alara was unusually quiet, watching the world with big, round, dark eyes, as if she understood that silence meant safety. Then everything changed. Mrs. Hargrove called her in at the end of a shift on a Tuesday afternoon. She was being moved up to the executive level, starting tomorrow. Brielle's stomach dropped to the floor. The executive level, where Asher Kane truly lived and worked, where cameras covered every corner and armed guards stood at every door. That night, Brielle sat on the floor of her rented room, Elara in her arms. Her daughter had just learned to crawl, those unsteady movements full of determination, meaning she couldn't stay still in one place anymore. Brielle had 3 choices: quit and starve, leave Elara somewhere unsafe, or risk everything. She chose risk. 2 weeks on the executive level, and Brielle became a master of fear. She memorized Asher's schedule down to the minute, knew which guard checked his phone at which hour, found every blind spot in the cameras. She worked twice as fast as anyone else, moving like a shadow, leaving no trace. But she couldn't stop Elara from growing. Every day the baby crawled faster, more curious, harder to keep quiet and still. That morning, as she tucked Elara into her hiding place, Brielle whispered into her ear, "Please, my love, just one more day." Elara patted her face with that tiny hand, and now, pressed against the wall of the executive hallway, watching her daughter crawl across the freezing marble floor toward those expensive Italian leather shoes, Brielle understood with crystal clarity that this had always been how it would end. There was no way back. Asher Kane had built his entire empire on a single rule: never show weakness. For 15 years, that rule had kept him alive. It had turned a street kid from Brooklyn into the man who controlled nearly half of New York's underworld. It made rivals think twice, allies fall into line, and enemies disappear. He'd been shot, betrayed, and stabbed in the back more times than he could count. Through it all, his face never changed. Iron Crown wasn't just a nickname, it was a warning. So when Elara's tiny hand wrapped around his ankle, Asher did what he always did. Nothing at all. He stood perfectly still, his expression frozen behind the neutral mask he'd worn for so long it had become his real face. The guards waited for a signal. One word and they'd erase this situation. One nod and the woman would be dragged away, the baby handed to the authorities. The problem would be wiped clean, neat, efficient, the way every problem in the Kane mansion was always handled. But Asher didn't give the signal, because something that wasn't supposed to happen was happening. Elara grabbed the fabric of his pant leg, those tiny fingers clamping down on expensive cloth with startling strength, and pulled herself upright. Her soft little legs trembled, wobbling, but she held her balance. Then she tipped her head back and looked up at him with those big, round, dark eyes. And she smiled. Not a frightened smile, not a hesitant one, pure, radiant, bursting with joy, as if she'd been searching for him everywhere and had finally found him, as if standing here, clinging to his leg, was the best thing that had happened to her all day. Asher felt a thaw he hadn't known in years. Not break, crack, like ice that had sealed itself for so long you forgot that underneath it was still only water. He'd seen every kind of look in his life. Fear, mostly. Hatred, greed, desperation, calculation. People looked at him and saw a weapon, a bank account, a threat, a solution to their problem. 15 years in the underworld, and no one, not a single person, had ever looked at him as if he deserved to be smiled at, until now. Until this 11-month-old baby, standing on trembling legs, clutching his pant leg, and smiling at him like he was her whole world. Elara made a sound, not quite a word, more like happy babbling, and then she lifted both arms, the universal gesture every parent on earth recognizes instantly. "Pick me up." Asher's hands that had never shaken, hesitated. "Sir," one of the guards stepped forward. "Should we?" "Don't." The words snapped out of Asher harsher than he'd intended. The guard backed away at once. In the edge of his vision, Asher saw the woman, the cleaner, pressed rigid against the wall. Her face was a mask of terror, tears streaming down her cheeks. She looked like she was watching her whole world collapse. Maybe she was, but Asher didn't look at her. He looked down at the baby with her arms raised toward him, patient, trusting, waiting. Then Asher Kane, the Iron Crown, the man the entire New York underworld feared, bent down and lifted the child into his arms. Elara immediately grabbed the collar of his suit vest. Tiny fingers crushed the expensive silk without a second thought. Then she did something that made every guard in the room stop breathing for the second time. She rested her small forehead against his. Not a strike, not fear. A gentle pat, like she was checking if he was real. like she was saying hello in her own way, the way only an 11-month-old could invent. Then she giggled, a clear, bright sound ringing through the deadly silent hallway, and that sound did what no rival, no bullet, no threat had ever managed to do. It cracked the ice a little more. Asher looked down at the baby in his arms. She'd rested her head against his shoulder, one hand still gripping his collar, the other patting his chest right where his heart beat, completely comfortable, completely trusting, as if this was where she belonged. No one in the room dared move. The guards looked at each other, confused, hands still on their weapons but with no idea where the enemy was. Mrs. Hargrove stood at the far end of the hallway, lips parted, and for the first time in 12 years, she had no answer for what she was seeing. And Brielle was still pressed against the wall, shaking, tears falling without stopping, waiting for the worst, waiting for the order, the footsteps that would drag her away, the cry of her daughter being ripped from her arms. But the worst didn't come. Instead, Asher Kane lifted his head, steel eyes meeting Brielle's horrified stare, and he spoke in a voice no one in the mansion had ever heard from him before. Calm, low, not an angry command and not a cold threat, just an instruction that somehow carried something close to caution. Bring this woman to my office. No one touches her. Then he turned away, Alara still in his arms, the baby busy playing with his silk tie, and he walked down the hallway as if nothing unusual had happened, as if a Mafia boss carrying an 11-month-old baby across the executive level was something that happened every day. Behind him, the guards stared at one another. Mrs. Hargrove closed her mouth, and Brielle, her legs shaking so badly she could barely walk, was escorted after him by 2 guards, not knowing whether she was walking toward salvation or deeper into hell. Asher Kane's office sat at the end of the executive hallway, behind 2 massive oak doors that Brielle had wiped down dozens of times, but had never once stepped through. Now, as the doors opened in front of her, Brielle was sure of only one thing. These were her last minutes in this place, and they might be the last minutes she would ever get to hold her daughter. She had imagined every possible outcome on the walk here: interrogation, threats, being handed to the police, being turned over to immigration, or worse things she'd heard whispered about this man. Stories of enemies who vanished without a trace, of rooms people walked into and never walked out of. She had braced herself for cruelty. What she hadn't braced for was the sight in front of her. Asher Kane sat behind a massive walnut desk, back against his leather chair, one leg crossed over the other, his expression still cold as steel. But on his lap, Alara sat as comfortably as if it were her favorite chair. Her daughter had pulled the silk tie out of the Mafia boss's vest and was happily chewing on one end of it, sometimes looking up at Asher and babbling something only she understood. That tie was probably worth more than 3 months of Brielle's pay. Asher didn't seem to care. Brielle froze in the doorway, unable to process what she was seeing. Her brain told her she was in mortal danger, but her eyes saw her daughter playing in the arms of the most dangerous man in New York, as if he were her own grandfather. Sit. Asher's voice cut straight through Brielle's chaos. Not an invitation. An order. Brielle sat in the chair across from the desk, knees knocking together, hands clenched tight around the hem of her cleaning uniform. She tried not to look at Alara, afraid that if she did, she'd cry, she'd beg, she'd fall apart completely. Asher didn't waste time. Name. Brielle Lawson, sir. Real name. Brielle swallowed. That is my real name. Asher studied her, steel eyes sweeping her face like he was reading fine print on a contract. She knew he was searching for signs of a lie. She also knew this man had probably read more liars than she could even imagine. Papers. I don't have any, sir. Silence. Alara babbled happily, breaking the tension in a way that felt almost unreal. Visa. Expired. 4 months ago. Asher didn't react. No raised brow, no sigh, no nod. Just that unreadable stare. Who got you in here? A friend of someone I knew. I don't know their real names. The baby. For the first time, something in Asher's voice shifted. Not gentle, not that, but less sharp. As if he was choosing his words in a way he didn't choose anything else. Why did you bring her in here? And in that moment, Brielle couldn't hold it anymore. Not because she wanted to manipulate him. Not because she was performing. But because that question, asked in that voice, in that room, with her daughter sitting on the lap of a man who could destroy her life with a single phone call, shattered every wall she'd built. Because getting fired means homelessness. Her voice trembled but didn't break. And homelessness means losing her. I don't have family. I can't afford childcare. I don't have anyone to watch her. I don't have anywhere to leave her where I know she'll be safe. So I brought her with me. Because it was the only choice I had that didn't end with losing her. She knew it was insane. She knew it was dangerous. She knew she'd gambled everything and had just lost. But she wouldn't apologize for choosing her daughter. The silence stretched on, long enough that Brielle could hear the clock ticking on the wall, hear Alara's soft breathing, hear her own heartbeat pounding in her ears. Then Asher asked, flat and emotionless, "How long has she been in this building?" 2.5 months, sir. For the first time, something changed on Asher's face. Not anger at her, not disgust, not pity. It was something sharper, more dangerous, aimed at somewhere else entirely. He turned and pressed the intercom button on his desk. "Sullivan, get in here. Now." The head of security appeared within 30 seconds, spine straight, face hard. Asher didn't look at him. She had found the only dead zone in the surveillance grid, a forgotten utility closet near the service elevator that the sensors failed to reach. His voice was low, even, and somehow that was more frightening than shouting. "I want to know why. I want to know before the end of the day. And I want a full reevaluation of the security system from the first floor to the third." Sullivan went pale by a shade. "Yes, sir." When Sullivan left, Brielle realized something she didn't dare believe. Asher wasn't angry there had been a baby in his mansion. He was angry his security team, the system he paid millions to maintain, had been outplayed by a 7-kilogram bundle of joy that could crawl and wore diapers. Asher looked back at Brielle. On his lap, Alara had stopped chewing the tie and was drifting into sleep, her head dropping against his chest, one hand still gripping the fabric of his vest. "You'll keep working. Your pay double's starting this week." Brielle was sure she'd misheard him. "The baby will have her own room on the staff floor. There will be someone to watch her during the day." Brielle opened her mouth, but no sound came out. She closed it, opened it again. Still nothing. She looked like a fish hauled onto land trying to breathe. Finally, a single word slipped from her lips, shaking, fragile. "Why?" Asher looked down at Alara. The baby was fully asleep now, her cheek pressed to his chest, her breathing soft and steady, fingers still refusing to let go of his vest, as if even in sleep she wouldn't leave. And in that moment, as he looked at the child sleeping in his arms, something in the Iron Crown's voice changed, not soft. Asher Kane didn't do soft. But something was there, hidden behind the steel, thin as a crack in ice. So subtle Brielle might have missed it if she hadn't been paying attention. "Because she's brave, and I don't punish bravery." Brielle walked out of the office on legs that couldn't feel the ground. She made it halfway down the hallway before she had to stop, pressing her back to the wall, and let the tears fall. Not tears of fear, not tears of relief, though relief was part of it. They were the tears of someone who had prepared to lose everything, and discovered she'd just been saved by the very person she feared most in this world. Behind the closed oak doors, Alara still slept in Asher's arms. And Asher, the man who never held anything he couldn't use or control, sat there motionless, unwilling to move in case he woke the baby. For the first time in 15 years, he didn't know what to do with his hands, so he simply sat there, holding still, and let the crack in his chest widen a little more. No one in the Kane mansion was prepared for what happened in the weeks that followed. Asher arranged childcare for Alara, 2 caregivers hired privately, with background checks more thorough than the security staff's. A private room on the staff floor was cleaned and set up with a crib, toys, everything a baby needed. A perfect plan. There was only one problem. Alara refused to cooperate. The first caregiver, a middle-aged woman with 20 years of experience, gave up after 3 days. Alara cried without stopping, refused to eat, refused to sleep, turned her face away every time the woman tried to hold her. The second lasted 5 days before admitting defeat. "She doesn't want me," the woman told Brielle, her voice mixed with confusion and a small sting of hurt. "She wants him," and that was the truth no one could understand. Alara, the baby who had been silent like a shadow for 2.5 months, the baby who had never made a sound louder than a whisper, now had one demand, and it was completely non-negotiable. She wanted to be near Asher Kane. Not sometimes. Not when he was free. Always. She crawled after him through the mansion like a tiny tail nothing could cut away. He went to the conference room. She crawled after him, He went down to the kitchen. She crawled after him. He stood by a window looking out over the city. She crawled to his feet and sat there, hand gripping his pant leg, eyes lifted up, patiently waiting for him to bend down. And the crazy thing was, Asher let her. No one understood why, especially the guards. Men who had watched Asher Kane do things that stole sleep from enemies now stood outside meeting rooms, staring through narrow glass panels with their mouths slightly open, watching their boss run a meeting with his associates, while an 11-month-old baby sat on his lap chewing on an expensive pen. Asher still gave orders in a steel voice. He still made decisions that made other men shiver, but in the middle of it, without breaking rhythm, he would gently take the pen out of Alara's mouth with one hand and replace it with a teething ring no one knew he had, then continue talking about numbers and territory as if nothing had happened. Small changes began to appear. Quiet, gradual, like a tide rising that no one notices, until the water is already at their knees. Asher lowered his voice when he walked through the hallway in the afternoon because Alara often took her nap at that hour. He threw a guard out of the third-floor corridor because the man smoked, and Asher didn't want the smell of smoke anywhere Alara might crawl. He called down to the kitchen, for the first time in the mansion's history, not to ask for whiskey or black coffee, but to ask about baby food for an 11-month-old. The head chef, the man who had cooked for Asher Kane for 8 years, had to sit down for a moment after that call. Mrs. Hargrove watched it all with her sharp eyes. One afternoon, she stood beside Brielle in the laundry room, the two of them looking through an interior window into Asher's office, where he was reading financial reports with one hand, the other resting on Alara's back as she slept on his chest, mouth slightly open, tiny hand gripping the fabric of his shirt. The image was so absurd and so beautiful, Brielle couldn't look away. Mrs. Hargrove spoke, her voice low, careful, as if she was admitting something she didn't fully believe. 12 years I've worked for him. 12 years. I've never seen him hold anything that wasn't a weapon or a glass. She paused, watching Asher turn a page with his thumb, while being careful not to shift his shoulder because Alara was asleep there. That baby has changed him already, she added, almost a whisper. Or she's changed back something that was always there and he buried it. Brielle said nothing. She only watched her daughter sleeping on the chest of the most powerful man she'd ever met, and wondered if an 11-month-old could see what adults could not. Conversations between Brielle and Asher began by accident. At first, they were only about Alara. She likes bananas more than apples. She's afraid of thunder. She won't sleep without that white cotton cloth. Asher listened to every detail with the focus he usually reserved for intelligence reports. Then, slowly, piece by piece, the conversation widened. Not big secrets, not candlelit confessions, just small fragments of life that fell naturally between them on afternoons when Alara slept, and they both stood in the kitchen waiting for coffee. Brielle talked about Ohio, about her grandmother, about cornfields in the fall. Asher didn't talk about himself, but he listened, truly listened, in a way Brielle had never been listened to before, and something began to form between them. Not love, not romance, not anything the movies or books described. It was trust. Slow, careful, fragile as thin ice on a lake in early spring, something that could crack at any moment, but still strong enough to step onto. Then came that night. 2 o'clock in the morning, Alara cried, not the hungry cry or the wet diaper cry, a frightened cry, a nightmare cry, even though Brielle didn't know what an 11-month-old could have nightmares about. Brielle jolted upright in bed, her feet not yet in her slippers, and her heart already pounding wildly. She ran down the hallway to Alara's room, but when she reached the door, she stopped cold on the threshold. Asher was already there. He stood in the middle of the room, Alara in his arms, the baby's face pressed to his neck, her crying fading, and Asher was singing. No, not exactly singing. He was humming a nameless melody, off rhythm, off key, the rough voice of a man who had never sung for anyone to hear. But he hummed steadily, softly, one hand patting Alara's back, his feet moving back and forth through the dark room. Alara quieted. The crying turned into hiccups. The hiccups turned into a long sigh. Then silence. She fell asleep again, head sinking onto his shoulder, fingers gripping his collar. Brielle stood outside the door, one hand on the frame, and she cried. Not a sound. Not a single breath of it. Only tears sliding down both cheeks in the dark. Not because she was sad, not because she was afraid, but because in 27 years, Through all those months of exhaustion as a single mother, waking up at 2 o'clock in the morning had always been alone, holding her baby and soothing her had always been alone, being afraid had always been alone, and this was the first time, someone else had woken up for her child. Someone had gotten there before she did. Someone had stood in the dark, humming off key, and kept her baby safe. Brielle wiped her tears with the back of her hand and stepped away quietly, leaving Asher there with Alara, unwilling to break this moment. She didn't know Asher had seen her shadow in the doorway, and he didn't say a word. He only kept pacing, humming that nameless tune, holding the sleeping baby against his shoulder. The Iron Crown, the man who built an empire on fear, was rocking a baby to sleep at 2 o'clock in the morning. And he didn't know that with every step across that dark room, with every awkward hum, he was becoming the one thing he hadn't believed he could be for 15 years. A father. It happened at 2:47 in the morning. 3 weeks after the night Asher hummed Alara back to sleep. An explosion. Not a distant boom, not fireworks or a car. A blast that shook the walls, the kind you feel in your bones before your ears can even catch up. Then darkness. The entire mansion dropped into pitch black in a single breath. Lights out. Backup lights out. Security monitors out. The camera system dead. The alarm system dead. Everything Asher Kane had paid millions to build, the entire technological fortress wrapped around the mansion, collapsed in less than 3 seconds. And in those 3 seconds of darkness, Asher didn't think about the safe in the basement holding documents that could destroy 6 politicians. He didn't think about the weapons room on the 3rd floor. He didn't think about the secret escape route only he and Sullivan knew. He thought about Alara. Only Alara. Instinct isn't something you choose. It chooses you. And in the moment that blast tore through the late night, Asher Kane's instinct told him exactly who he was. Not a mafia boss, not the Iron Crown, but a man with a baby sleeping downstairs who needed to be protected. He moved through the dark as if the mansion were an extension of his own body. 15 years of living in danger had taught him how to see without light, how to listen when everything was chaos, how to separate an enemy's footsteps from an ally's. He heard gunshots on the 1st floor, glass breaking, shouting, and the crackling hiss of security radios trying to re-establish contact. Donovan Cruz. The name flashed through Asher's mind like lightning. Cruz had been circling his territory for months, probing, looking for gaps, waiting for timing, and now he'd found it. Not a hole in the security system. Not a weakness in the business network. Something far worse. The only thing in the world Asher Kane couldn't replace. Asher reached Alara's room in under 90 seconds. He kicked the door open and saw Brielle already there, curled on the floor in the darkest corner. Alara pressed to her chest, her body wrapped around the baby like a shield. She was shaking so hard Asher could hear her teeth knocking together. But she wasn't crying. She wasn't screaming. She was only holding her child and trembling, eyes wide in the dark, ready for whatever stepped through that door. When she realized it was Asher, a sound tore loose from her throat, half a sob, half a breath she'd been holding too long. He dropped to his knees beside her. "Come with me." His voice was low, calm, solid, the voice of a man who had survived worse than this. "Don't let go of my hand." He guided them into the hall, toward the service stairs in the east wing of the mansion. One hand went to Brielle's back, pushing her forward. His body stayed between them and the open corridor, his back to where the gunfire echoed, a living shield of bone and flesh between danger and the 2 people he was protecting. They reached the service stairs when Asher heard footsteps above. Fast, purposeful, not his security team. His men wore soft-soled leather shoes. These footsteps wore hard-soled tactical boots. He shoved Brielle and Alara back, pressing them into the corner, then turned to face the upper stairs. A black shape appeared on the steps. 2 men, armed. They saw him at the same moment he saw them. What happened next unfolded in less than a breath. Asher moved with an instinct no class could teach, an instinct forged on Brooklyn streets, forged through 15 years in a world where being 1 second slow meant dying. He locked the first man's arm, pivoted, used the man as a shield to throw the second off balance. Both of them went down on the stairs. Asher kept the advantage, but in the struggle, something sharp sliced across his shoulder, pain flaring white-hot. He clenched his teeth, made no sound, and ended it in 2 decisive moves. The attackers lay motionless on the steps, not dead, but they wouldn't be getting up for a very long time. Asher turned back to the corner where Brielle was crouched. His shoulder was soaked, the wound bleeding through his shirt, but he didn't look down. He looked only at Alara, and this was what changed everything. Between the gunfire echoing from below, in the dark, in the acrid stench of gunpowder and cement, in all that chaos, Alara didn't cry. She lay in Brielle's arms, big dark eyes wide open, staring straight at Asher, calm, quiet, as if she understood, with the pure instinct of a child, that this man wouldn't let anything touch her. Then Alara lifted her small hand and patted Asher's face, gentle, slow, the way she had on that first day in the hallway. But this time it was different. This time it wasn't a greeting. It was comfort. An 11-month-old baby, in the middle of an attack, comforting the man who had just had just taken down 2 attackers to protect her. "Sir, your shoulder." Brielle's voice shook. "It's fine." But Asher couldn't take his eyes off Alara. She kept patting his face, gentle, patient, like she was saying everything would be all right, like she believed him, like she was here. Footsteps from below. Sullivan appeared, weapon ready. "Sir, we've secured the perimeter. 4 down, 2 escaped. We need to move you too." Sullivan stopped when he saw the scene. Asher Kane, the Iron Crown, sitting in a service stairwell, shoulder drenched in blood, holding a baby who was patting his face while the baby's mother clung to his arm. "Get them to the safe room." Asher's voice didn't shake. It didn't hesitate. "Maximum security. No one in or out without my direct order. Sir, you need medical. After." Asher stood, careful to keep Alara in his arms, his shoulders spiking with pain at every movement. The baby clung to his shirt and showed no sign of letting go. They moved to the safe room, the reinforced steel chamber in the basement, with an independent air system Asher had built for himself and had never once imagined he'd use for anyone else. As the steel door prepared to close, Asher carefully transferred Alara into Brielle's arms. The baby protested at once, reaching for him, her face tightening like she might cry for the first time tonight. Asher stopped. He leaned in until his forehead touched Alara's, and he spoke softly, for her ears only. "I'll be right outside." Alara looked at him with those big dark eyes, then slowly let go. Brielle reached for Asher's hand through the narrowing gap of the door. Her fingers tightened, hard enough that he felt every trembling joint. "Thank you for not letting go of us." Asher looked at her hand in his, small, shaking, but gripping with a strength he hadn't expected. "I don't think I can anymore." The steel door shut. Asher stood there for a moment, staring at it, then turned to Sullivan, who was waiting with a tactical report and a first aid kit. Asher's jaw tightened. Someone had gotten into his home, had threatened what belonged to him, had forced Alara to be in darkness, instead of sleeping peacefully in her crib. "Find Donovan Cruz." His voice dropped so low Sullivan had to lean in, "and make sure every crew in New York understands what happens when they touch my family." Sullivan nodded and disappeared into the dark. 24 hours later, the message had spread into every corner of New York's underworld. The Iron Crown has a family, and anyone who thought that was a weakness realized, too late, that it was what made him more dangerous than ever. Because before, Asher Kane fought for power. Now he fought for something he couldn't replace. And there is nothing on earth more dangerous than a man protecting what he loves. Dawn was breaking over the Manhattan horizon when Asher Kane stepped through the mansion's front doors. The first light fell across his face and exposed what last night's darkness had hidden. Deep shadows under his eyes, a stain on his shirt he didn't want to think about the source of. His left shoulder wrapped tight beneath a fresh coat, every movement pulling a dull ache that reminded him the human body has limits, even the body of the Iron Crown. He was exhausted. Not the kind exhaustion that comes from missed sleep, but the kind that hits when the body has spent every drop of adrenaline and now demands payment. He should have gone to his room, should have showered, let his private doctor check the wound again, let his body rest. Instead, his feet took him downstairs to the basement, to the safe room, as if they knew where he belonged before his mind could catch up. He entered the code with fingers gone numb. The steel door opened without a sound. Inside, soft light spilled over a scene that was somehow ordinary and extraordinary at once. Brielle was asleep in an armchair in the corner, her head tilted at an angle that looked painfully uncomfortable, one hand hanging loose, the other still resting on the edge of the crib, as if even in sleep she wouldn't let go of her child. Her face carried the marks of last night, dried tear tracks on her cheeks, the worry line between her brows still tight. But Alara wasn't asleep. The baby stood in the crib, tiny hands gripping the wooden rail, eyes wide, fixed on the door, not wandering. This was the gaze of someone who was waiting, patient, certain, as if she knew, with absolute certainty, that he would come back, and she would wait until he did, even if it took all night. The moment Alara saw Asher step through the doorway, her face lit up. There was no other way to describe it. Lit up, like someone had flipped a switch behind her eyes. Her smile bloomed, radiant, complete. The smile she reserved for him. The smile Asher still didn't understand why he deserved. She lifted both arms and waved them toward him, babbling nonstop, joy spilling out as if she had 1,000 things to say but not enough words yet. Asher crossed the room and lifted her out of the crib. His left shoulder flared with pain as he raised Alara. But he didn't wince, didn't slow. She immediately melted against his chest, both arms around his neck. And then she did what she always did. She patted his face. Her chubby hand touched his cheek, his forehead, checking, exploring, as if making sure he was still whole, still here, still real. Then she babbled something that almost sounded like a word, nodding as if answering her own question. Yes, he's back. He's okay. Good. Asher stood in the safe room holding an 11-month-old baby and felt her small weight settled against his chest, right where his heart beat. She had waited for him, all night, while her mother slept from exhaustion. Alara had stood in the crib and waited for him to return. Not because she was afraid, because she believed he would. "You shouldn't trust me this much," he whispered, his voice rough from exhaustion and something he refused to name. "I'm not a good man, Alara." Alara lifted her head and looked at him, those big dark eyes shining under the soft lights, and then she smiled. She laughed, a bright, clear laugh trembling through the reinforced steel room, as if he'd just told the funniest thing she'd ever heard, as if the idea that he wasn't a good man was a joke, too ridiculous to be possible. Asher watched her laugh, and the crack in his chest. The crack that had begun on the first day in the hallway, that had widened with every off-key hum in the dark, that had split further when he'd raced through darkness to reach her room first. That crack finally broke all the way open. Not painful. Not the breaking of something ruined. The breaking of a shell that had been too tight for too long, because what lived inside had outgrown it. Alara's laughter woke Brielle. She startled, sitting upright, eyes wide with panic for a heartbeat before her mind could process what she was seeing. Asher stood in the middle of the room holding Alara, the baby happily patting his ear. His shoulder was bandaged. His eyes were red from lack of sleep. But he was here. Brielle rose, stepped closer, then stopped a few paces away. She looked at the bandage on his shoulder, the stain at his collar he hadn't had time to change, the swollen knuckles. She knew what he'd done last night. No one needed to tell her, she knew. The man in front of her had used violence, had broken rules, had done things the outside world would condemn, and he had done it all for her. For Alara. "I know who you are." Brielle's voice was soft, steady, not trembling at all, and that surprised Asher more than anything from last night. "I've always known." She took another step closer. "But I also know what you did. You could have run. You could have saved yourself. You could have let them take us and used that to negotiate. But you didn't." Silence. Alara babbled happily between them, carefree, unaware that this conversation was changing everything. Asher looked at Brielle, then at Alara, then back at Brielle. And when he spoke, his voice didn't carry the hesitation he'd carried for 15 years. Not steel, not command, just certainty, pure and simple, the kind of certainty he'd never felt in any deal or decision inside his empire. "I'm going to legalize your status and adopt Alara. Your family now. Papers, lawyers, everything legal. You and Alara aren't staff anymore. You belong to me to protect. Anyone who wants to touch you has to go through me. And after last night, I don't think anyone will be stupid enough to try." Brielle stared at him, her eyes searching for a lie, for exaggeration, for the kind of promise that turns to smoke once the sun rises higher. She had believed a man's promises before. She had learned the price of trusting the wrong one. "You mean it, not a question. Half statement, half challenge. I've never meant anything more." Alara chose that exact moment to reach up and grab Asher's nose. Tiny fingers clamped down and tugged, and when Asher pretended to gently bite her fingers, Alara burst into laughter, the sound echoing through the cold steel room and turning it into the warmest place on earth. Brielle watched them, a Mafia boss with a bandaged shoulder pretending to bite a baby's fingers while she laughed, and she felt something break inside herself. Not a crack, a wall. The wall she had built after being abandoned, the wall that kept her from believing anyone would stay. That wall shuddered and collapsed. "That baby saved you," she whispered, her voice shaking with emotion, with disbelief, with something like hope she hadn't dared to feel in a very long time. An 11-month-old baby saved the Iron Crown. Asher looked down at Alara, who was now busy playing with his collar, babbling a wordless song, and he smiled. He truly smiled. Not the cold smile he used in negotiations, not the threatening smile he used on enemies. A real smile, his first in years. A smile that made him look 10 years younger and revealed the man buried under 15 years of steel and ice. "No," he said, his voice so gentle Brielle had to lean in to hear it. "She reminded me I still have a heart. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is look at someone not as the person they've been forced to become, but as the person they could be." Brielle had never intended to change anyone. She was only trying to survive. But Alara, that 11-month-old baby, had plans of her own. She looked straight through the Iron Crown's reputation, through violence, through the fear everyone else carried. She saw someone worth smiling at. And that changed everything. 10 years. 10 years since that night in the safe room. Since the promise. Since the Iron Crown's first smile. And if you looked at the Kane Mansion on this Saturday afternoon in June, you wouldn't recognize the place. Purple and silver balloons floated across the ceiling of the grand ballroom, the same room that 10 years earlier had been a meeting space for negotiations no one wanted to know the details of. A glittering banner stretched along the wall with the words, "Happy 11th Birthday, Alara," written in the font Alara herself had chosen, because she insisted the default font looked boring, and she wanted something with more personality. That was Alara at 10. Personality. Sharp, intelligent, brave in a way that made Brielle proud and worried at the same time. She had her mother's warm smile, the kind that made people feel welcomed. But behind it lived Asher's razor-edged gaze. The gaze that read a room before walking into it. She knew exactly when someone was telling the truth, and when someone was performing, a skill Asher didn't know whether to be proud of or uneasy about. The mansion was filled with children's laughter, music, friends of Alara racing through the rooms while the security team stood at the corners trying to look as normal as possible, which wasn't easy when you were 6'1" in a black suit in the middle of 10-year-olds, throwing balloons at each other. Sullivan stood near the cake table, wearing an expression as severe as if he were guarding a head of state, one hand still hovering near his hip, out of habit, even though the biggest threat in the room right now was a boy trying to dip his finger into the frosting before it was time to cut. And Brielle stood by a tall window with a glass of water in her hand, watching everything with eyes that still didn't fully believe what she was seeing. She had changed, not only on the outside, though the outside was different too. An elegant dress instead of a cleaning uniform, a confident posture instead of hunched shoulders, calm eyes instead of a gaze fixed on the floor. But the change went deeper than that. Brielle Lawson was now Asher Kane's equal partner, the woman he asked for counsel, the woman who could look him in the eye and say no and have him listen. No one in the mansion treated her like staff anymore, because no one dared, and because no one wanted to. The music shifted into Alara's favorite song. She emerged from the crowd of friends, hair a little messy from playing, eyes bright, and walked straight to where Asher stood in the corner with a cup of coffee, his face wearing the expression anyone who knew him recognized: distant, watchful, controlled, the standard Iron Crown look. "Dance with me, Dad." "No. Dad. No. Dad, you've faced a room full of armed men for me. Are you telling me a dance floor scares you?" Asher looked down at his daughter, her eyes sparkling with mischief, her mouth curling at the corner exactly the way his did when he knew he'd won a negotiation. She had learned that from him, using his own move against him, and they both knew it. This was their ritual, Alara teased. Asher played stern. She pushed. He pretended not to budge. Then he gave in. Always. Because beneath all the steel, he had never been able to refuse her. And Alara had known that since she was 11 months old and crawled straight toward him. Asher set his coffee down, grimaced like he was walking into something dangerous, then let Alara drag him into the center of the room. The Iron Crown doesn't dance. That was the rule. But rules didn't apply to this girl. He danced badly. Terribly, actually. Stiff, offbeat, arms moving like a robot with a software glitch. Ilara howled with laughter, trying to fix his hands, stomping in rhythm so he could copy her. Sullivan turned his face toward the wall, shoulders shaking. 2 guards at the door looked at each other and bit their lips. Mrs. Hargrove stood by the food table and smiled so wide for the first time in her life, her jaw ached. And Brielle pulled out her phone and filmed, smiling, tears rising in her eyes. She watched them dance, a mafia boss and a 10-year-old girl, both laughing, both belonging to each other completely. And she thought of the supply closet on the 2nd floor 10 years earlier. She thought of the smell of bleach. She thought of the cleaning cart with the false bottom made of cardboard. She thought of the 27-year-old woman trembling against a wall, certain she was about to lose everything. That woman would never have believed this scene, not in a million years. The song ended. Ilara hugged Asher, her face pressed to his stomach because she only came up to his chest. He rested a hand on her head, gentle, natural, the gesture of a man who had done it 1,000 times. Then the cake was brought out. 11 candles. Ilara stood in front of the table, eyes squeezed shut, lips moving in a wish she would never say out loud. Open your eyes. Blow. 11 flames went out at once. The room exploded in cheers. Asher stood behind her, watching his daughter, and felt something he still wasn't used to after 10 years. Peace. Absolute, complete peace. The kind of peace he hadn't believed he would ever feel back when he was a Brooklyn street kid 15 years ago. The outside world still called him Steel. It still feared him. It still told horror stories about the Iron Crown. But the outside world didn't see this. It didn't see him dancing off beat with his daughter. It didn't see him cut the first slice of cake and hand it to Ilara with both hands. It didn't see him glance across the room at Brielle and give a small nod, a gesture only the 2 of them understood, meaning, we're okay, we're here, we're safe. Then his phone vibrated. Asher looked at the screen. 3 words. Situation at the gate. He swiped the message open. Sullivan had added the next line. There's a man claiming to be Ilara's biological father. He has photos. He has old paperwork with your name. Lawson. He came prepared. The party room was still full of laughter. Ilara was still opening gifts with her friends. The 10 candles had only just gone out, and the world Asher had spent 10 years building shifted under his feet. He stepped into the hallway and called Brielle into a private room. No explanation. None was needed. Brielle took one look at his face and knew something had happened. Inside, Asher pulled up the gate security camera feed without a word. On the screen, a man in his 30s stood in front of the iron gate in a suit, a folder of documents in his hand, a confident smile on his face. Brielle stared at the screen. The blood drained from her face. 10 years since she'd last seen that face, but she recognized it instantly, in every line, in the way he tilted his head, in that smile, the smile that had once made her believe she was loved. She said only one word, Travis. Brielle sat on the edge of the bed in the private room, both hands clenched together on her lap, knuckles bleached white. Asher stood by the window, giving her space, waiting. Over 10 years, he'd learned when to push and when to simply be there. This was the time to be there. Down the hall, the laughter of children still drifted from the ballroom. Ilara was still opening gifts, still laughing, still unaware that the man at the gate was about to make her question everything she'd ever believed. Then Brielle began to speak. Her voice was low, rough, like she was pulling each word up from somewhere deep and dark she'd kept locked for 11 years. His name is Travis Mercer. She met him in Ohio, 2 years after her grandmother died. She was 23, working at her uncle's restaurant. So lonely, her bones felt lonely, and Travis Mercer walked into her life like the answer to every prayer she hadn't known she'd whispered. He was everything she thought she wanted. Confident, charming, full of big plans. He talked about starting a business, about the future, about the house they'd buy, about the life they'd build. He said he loved her and she believed him. God, she believed him. Because when you have no one left in the world, and someone looks at you like you're everything, you don't ask why, you just grab on and hold tight. When she found out she was pregnant, Travis seemed happy. He talked about marriage. He talked about family. He talked about a future in a voice so certain Brielle started buying baby things. 3 weeks. 3 weeks she lived inside that illusion. Then one afternoon she came home from work, 5 months pregnant, feet swollen, back aching, and found the apartment empty. Not empty because Travis had stepped out. Empty because Travis was gone. His clothes were gone, his bag was gone, and her savings account. Every cent she'd scraped together over 4 years, every restaurant tip, every extra shift, every meal she'd skipped to save money, it was all gone. He left only one thing behind. A note on the kitchen table, scribbled in rushed handwriting she still remembered stroke for stroke to this day. "I'm not ready to be tied down." 7 words. He reduced everything between them to 7 words and vanished. She looked for him, called everyone she knew. His friends said he'd gone to Atlantic City, or maybe Florida. No one knew for sure. No one cared enough to find out. After 2 months, Brielle stopped looking. She had to focus on surviving, on the baby growing inside her, on the reality that she was about to become a mother alone at 23, with a bank balance of 0. That was the last time she heard anything about Travis Mercer. Until 10 minutes ago, Brielle stopped. Asher didn't speak. He didn't need to. His silence said more than any words could. But this was what Brielle didn't know, what no one in the Kaine mansion knew, and what would make everything 10 times more complicated. Travis Mercer's story didn't begin at the mansion gate with a suit and a folder of documents. It began 3 weeks earlier, in a cheap bar in Atlantic City, where Travis sat hunched over a coffee he'd been stretching for 2 hours, scrolling his phone so he wouldn't have to think about the 2 men looking for him. Loan sharks, the kind you don't find on Google. The kind where if you don't pay on time, they don't call a lawyer. They send someone to knock on your door at 3 a.m. Travis owed $50,000 and had exactly $47 in his account. 3 weeks. That was the deadline. Then the social media algorithm, mindless, did what fate sometimes does. Put the right thing in front of the right person at the right moment. A post going viral. New York billionaire and an unexpected family moment. The photo showed a stern Asian man in an expensive suit, and sitting on his shoulders, laughing, fearless, radiant, was a little girl. But it was the woman standing beside him that froze Travis's coffee in midair. Brielle. Older, more polished, but unmistakable. And if that little girl was around 10, Travis did the math fast. 11 years since he'd left Ohio, minus 9 months. So the pregnancy had been real. It had become a child. And that child was sitting on the shoulders of a man Google said was worth billions. Travis's heart sped up. Not from regret, not from longing or late-arriving fatherhood. From opportunity. Pure, electric, blazing opportunity. A man that rich, with a reputation like that, would pay any price to protect his image. And what could destroy that image faster than a biological father showing up and demanding rights? DNA, legal paperwork, custody. This wasn't a sentimental story. This was leverage. Travis opened a new tab and started researching. Within an hour, he knew everything he needed to know. Asher Kaine's billioness empire. The shift from underworld operations to legal companies. The obsessive privacy. And now Travis had what no one else did. A biological connection to the child Kaine called his. He called the loan sharks. His voice was confident for the first time in months. "I just found my retirement plan. Give me more time. 3 more weeks." Travis sold his laptop, sold his watch, scraped together enough to buy a plane ticket to New York. On the flight, he scrolled through photos of Alara online. Pictures someone posted from school. Pictures from charity events. Paparazzi shots. She was smiling in every one. A wide, radiant, fearless smile. Like Brielle. So much like her that Travis stopped his finger on the screen. For 1 second, only 1 second, something stabbed in his chest. Not quite regret. Maybe the ghost of regret, or the ghost of something like regret. The feeling ordinary people would call a conscience. But Travis Mercer had never been used to using it. She had Brielle's smile. She could have had that smile with him, if he'd stayed. That moment lasted exactly 1 heartbeat. Then Travis swiped to the next page, the notes app where he'd written numbers, timelines, an approach strategy. The moment passed. He could have chosen differently. He could have let that smile change him, the way Alara's smile had changed Asher Kaine 10 years earlier. But Travis Mercer wasn't Asher Kaine. He looked at his daughter's smile and saw a $sign. He landed at JFK in a cheap, slightly oversized suit he'd scrounged together to look the part of a successful father. A folder of documents filled with old photos and paperwork bearing Brielle's name, and a smile he'd practiced in the mirror for the entire flight. Travis Mercer had arrived. And he carried something Asher Kaine's entire empire couldn't erase with money or violence. DNA. In the private room, Brielle looked at Asher, eyes red, but her voice so calm it was frightening. He's not here for her. He's here for money. I know. Asher stood by the window, spine straight, jaw clenched. This wasn't about father and daughter. This was a negotiation. He turned back to Brielle, and in his eyes was something colder than steel, colder than winter, cold in a way every man who described had faced him before recognized, and wished they hadn't recognized too late. And no one negotiates with my family. Alara knew something was wrong before anyone said a word to her. She knew because her father stopped dancing. Not dancing in the literal sense, because Asher Kane only danced when Alara forced him to. But he stopped the way he was with her on her birthday night. The smile vanished. His shoulders went rigid. His eyes swept the room in a way Alara recognized instantly, the way he scanned when there was a threat. She was 10, not 3. She'd lived in the Iron Crown's mansion long enough to know when the air changed. So when Asher and Brielle sat her down the next morning and explained that there was a man who wanted to meet her, a man with a biological connection to her, Alara didn't cry, didn't scream, didn't ask why. She only looked at her parents with calm, dark eyes and asked a single question. Is Dad okay? Not about Travis. Not about herself. About Asher. Because Alara had spent 10 years watching this man, learning identifying every crease in his forehead, every tightening of his jaw, every moment he spoke calmly, while his eyes spoke storms, and she knew this news was breaking him from the inside, even if he would never admit it. The meeting was scheduled for the following afternoon. The second-floor sitting room, cameras in every corner, Sullivan outside the door with the expression of a man ready to break it down if he heard anything suspicious. Asher wanted to sit in. Brielle wanted to sit in. But the lawyer advised that Alara meet him alone, with remote supervision, so the court couldn't claim she was being influenced. So Alara walked in by herself. And Travis Mercer was already there. He stood when she entered, a movement a fraction too fast, a fraction too eager, like an actor stepping on stage half a beat before his cue. He wore a suit, the same borrowed suit but carefully pressed. In his hands was a large teddy bear, the kind adults buy when they don't know what a 10-year-old actually likes. His eyes were red. Maybe from crying. Maybe from eye drops. Alara didn't know, and she noted that. Hello, Alara. His voice trembled. Trembled just enough. Audible, but not so much it turned theatrical. I know you don't know who I am, and I know this is a shock, but I want you to know that not a single day has passed that I haven't thought about you. He sat across from her and placed the teddy bear on the table between them like an offering. His eyes held Alara's, wet, sincere in a way most adults would believe instantly. Leaving you and your mother was the biggest mistake of my life, he said, his voice breaking in exactly the right place. Not one day goes by that I don't regret it. Not one day goes by that I don't wish I could go back and do it differently. You're my daughter, Alara, my blood, and I came here because I want to be part of your life, even if it's only a small part. He said everything right. Every word, every pause, every look, flawless. If there was a script for the role of the remorseful father, Travis Mercer was reading it without missing a comma. Alara sat still, back straight, hands resting on her lap, her face polite, composed, giving away nothing. Thank you for the bear, she said, her voice courteous, using sir instead of dad, and if Travis noticed, remember it, he hid it well. It's very cute. Then silence. Alara looked at Travis, but not with the look he was hoping for. Not the curious look of a child meeting her father for the first time. Not the tearful look. Not the joyful look. Not the angry one. This was the look of someone weighing evidence. She studied Travis the way Asher studied an opponent, measuring every word, sorting every pause, noting every detail that didn't fit. Eyes too practiced, tears arriving too on time. A story too smooth. No stumbles, no real hesitation. None of the mess of genuine emotion. Someone truly sorry would be clumsier. Someone truly in pain wouldn't sound so polished. Alara knew this because she lived with Asher, the man who hid emotion better than anyone in the world, and she'd spent 10 years learning how to see through masks. She knew what real emotion looked like when it was buried, and she knew what fake emotion looked like when it was displayed. Travis was displaying, but she wasn't 100% sure. Maybe she was wrong. Maybe he truly regretted it, and he was simply the type of man who expressed emotion with neat words. Maybe 10 years of distance had made him rehearse what he wanted to say until it sounded perfect. Maybe she was carrying her father's bias into this meeting. So she didn't decide. She observed. She stayed polite. She accepted the bear. She said thank you. And she didn't open her heart. Travis left the mansion 45 minutes later with heavier steps than when he arrived. He had prepared for anger, for tears, for a hug, for every dramatic reaction he could use as leverage. He hadn't prepared for the cool politeness of a 10-year-old who looked at him like he was a problem to solve, not a father to forgive. Up on the executive floor, Asher and Brielle watched the entire recording. Brielle recognized it first. "That's the face he used when he convinced me to give him my savings," she said, her voice flat. "Exactly the same. Every line." Asher shut off the screen. His jaw tightened. "There won't be another meeting. Tell Sullivan." Brielle placed a hand on his arm, gentle but firm. Asher stopped and looked at her, and in Brielle's eyes he saw something he didn't expect. Not fear, not panic, the calm of someone who had made a decision. "If you destroy him, Alara will never forgive you. She'll always wonder, always doubt, always think maybe you stole her chance to know the truth for herself." Asher opened his mouth, but Brielle wasn't finished. "Let her meet him again." Her voice was steady as stone. "She needs to see it with her own eyes. I trust her." Asher looked at her, the woman who had once trembled against a hallway wall 10 years ago, the woman who had cried in fear, who had run because she had no other choice. That woman stood in front of him now, spine straight, eyes clear, telling the Iron Crown he was wrong and she was right, and he needed to listen. Not because she was weak, because she was strong enough to believe their daughter was strong too. Asher was silent for a long time. Then he nodded. One single nod. Travis Mercer received word that a second meeting was approved, but he didn't enjoy it for long, because when emotional tactics didn't work, Travis did what he always did when things didn't go his way. He escalated. Within a week, he hired a lawyer with loan shark money and filed a petition demanding a DNA test and formal visitation rights. The legal papers arrived at the Kane mansion on a Tuesday morning, pristine and cold, carrying the one thing guns and gangs couldn't give Travis: the power of the legal system. Asher's attorney called that same afternoon, his voice more cautious than usual. "Sir, legally, the biological father has certain rights. DNA is difficult to dispute. The court may force visitation." Asher listened, silent, then ended the call without saying a word. He stood in his study, staring out the window, and for the first time in 10 years, the Iron Crown faced an enemy he couldn't take down with strength, with money, or with fear. This enemy carried the only weapon Asher Kane had no way to neutralize: bloodline rights. Travis Mercer appeared on a talk show on a Wednesday afternoon, and within 24 hours everything Asher Kane had built over 10 years began to tremble in a way no gang, no rival, no bullet had ever managed. The studio lights blazed. Travis wore a pale blue shirt, no suit this time, because a suit looked too wealthy, too calculated, and someone had advised him that a pale blue shirt suggested an ordinary father, approachable, trustworthy. He sat across from the host, back slightly curved, shoulders slightly slumped, the posture of a man carrying a burden too heavy. And when the camera pushed in close, Travis Mercer cried. Tears ran down both cheeks, slow, at just the right pace. Not so much it looked ridiculous, not so little it looked fake. Perfect. "I just want to meet my daughter." His voice broke, and millions of viewers heard that break and felt their hearts pinch. "I made a mistake. I left when I shouldn't have. But for 11 years, there hasn't been a single day I haven't thought about her. And now, when I finally have the courage to come back, there's a man, a very powerful man, a very rich man, standing between me and my daughter. I don't have money to hire great lawyers. I don't have a mansion. I don't have a security team. I only have a father's love. And I'm losing because in this world, love isn't enough when your opponent has billions of dollars." The host nodded with sympathy. The audience dabbed at their eyes, and the internet exploded. A hashtag spread within hours. The story flooded every social platform. An image of Travis holding an old photo, a photo he'd pulled from the internet and edited with care, but no one knew that, was shared hundreds of thousands of times. Public opinion split, but most people leaned toward Travis, because the story was too perfect for this era. A poor father robbed of his child by a billionaire, David against Goliath, hard against money. And Asher Kane, the man the media had always been waiting for an excuse to dig into, became the perfect villain. A secretive billionaire with a dark past keeping another man's daughter. Headlines ran all day. Comments overflowed with rage aimed at a man they had never met, based on the story of a man they had never met either. The world looked in and saw exactly what Travis wanted them to see. Alara found out the next day at school, in the worst way possible. Not from her parents, not from a teacher, from a classmate who held up a phone at lunch and asked, "Hey, is this your real dad?" loud enough that half the table turned to stare. Alara looked at the screen, saw Travis's face on the talk show, saw the line of text beneath it. Biological father claims billionaire stole his daughter. She said nothing. Didn't react. Her expression slammed shut like a steel door. A look she'd learned from Asher without realizing it. The automatic mask that appeared when the outside world turned dangerous. She sat through lunch. Sat through the afternoon. Rode home in the car with Sullivan driving. Silent the entire way. Staring out the window without seeing anything. When Brielle asked how her day was, Alara said fine, and walked straight to her room. The door closed gently. Not slammed. No tears. Just closed. And somehow that gentleness hurt more than any slammed door ever could. Asher knew. He knew the moment Alara came through the door without looking at him, without teasing him, without grabbing his hand, without doing any of the hundreds of small rituals they'd built over 10 years. And it burned him in a way no wound ever had. That night, after everyone was asleep, Asher sat alone in his study. The lights were off. Only the city glow seeped through the windows, casting bright and dark across his face. His hand gripped the arm of the chair, knuckles white. The old instinct roared inside him like an animal caged too long. One call. Just one call. Sullivan would take the order. Within 48 hours, Travis Mercer would disappear. Not the kind of disappear that meant death. Asher didn't need to go that far, but the kind of disappear that meant Travis would never dare set foot in the same time zone as Alara again. Problem solved. Clean. Efficient. The way Asher had solved problems for 15 years. He reached for the phone on the desk. His fingers touched the cold casing. Then his gaze fell on the photo beside it. Alara at 5, sitting on his shoulders, smiling wide, both arms around his head, hair a mess from the wind. He remembered that day. Central Park. Autumn. Yellow leaves falling, and Alara wanted to catch them from up high, so he hoisted her onto his shoulders. She laughed the entire afternoon. Sullivan had taken that picture because Brielle asked, and it became Asher's favorite photo, even though he never admitted it to anyone. He stared at that smile in the frame. Then he thought of Alara's eyes this afternoon, when she walked past him without looking. If he made that call. If Travis vanished. And if, somehow, Alara found out, she would look at him with different eyes. Not the eyes of an 11-month-old baby who crawled toward him and smiled. The eyes everyone else had used. Fear, disgust. The eyes that saw a monster. And Asher Kane could endure anything in this world except that. He pulled his hand back, slowly, set it on the chair arm again, gripped, then released. He chose Brielle's way. He chose patience. He chose trust, that the truth would reveal itself, the hardest thing he'd ever done, and he had faced guns, knives, betrayal, nights so long they felt like they had no dawn. But nothing was harder than sitting still and doing nothing while his daughter was hurting. At the same time, in the bedroom at the end of the hall, Alara lay on her bed, eyes open, staring at the ceiling. Brielle sat on the edge of the bed, silent, waiting. She had learned from Asher how to wait. When to speak, and when to simply be there. "Mom." Alara's voice was small, fragile in a way Brielle rarely heard. What was he like, back then? Was he always bad like that? Or did he become bad? Brielle took a deep breath. She could lie. She could say Travis had always been a monster, always a con man, always terrible. But that wasn't the truth. And Brielle had promised herself the day Alara was born that she would never protect her child with lies. "He was charming," she said, her voice steady, honest to the end. "He made me feel like everything would be okay." I didn't know whether that was true or not. Alara was quiet for a long time. Brielle listened to her daughter, breathe in, breathe out, breathe in, breathe out. Then, smaller, almost a whisper, the voice of a 10-year-old trying to understand an adult world she'd been thrown into too early. What if he really changed? Brielle didn't answer right away. She placed a hand on her daughter's hair, stroked gently, and let the question hang in the darkness between them. Because she didn't have an answer. Because it was a question only Ilara could answer for herself. The court order arrived at the end of the week. Ilara was to meet Travis at a public cafe, supervised by a court-appointed monitor. Asher and Brielle were not allowed to interfere, not allowed to be present, not allowed to influence. Asher read the order, folded the paper carefully, and set it on the table. Every cell in his body wanted to shout no, that he wouldn't let his daughter sit across from that man without him there, that he had fought, bled, changed his very nature for her, and now the law told him to stand outside. But he looked at Brielle. She nodded, small and certain. Trust her. Asher hated this, hated every second. But he let Ilara go, because love sometimes meant stepping aside and believing the person you loved was strong enough to face the truth, even when the truth could destroy everything. The cafe sat on a quiet corner in the West Village, the kind of place with big glass windows, worn wooden chairs, and the smell of small batch roasted coffee that New Yorkers called cozy and Asher Kane called a security gap. No side exit. Too many windows. Tables set too close together. Sullivan had scoped the location at dawn and sent Asher a 3-page report that Asher read twice before grinding his teeth and folding it up, because there was nothing he could do with that information except swallow his helplessness. The court order said a public cafe, supervised. Not the mansion, not his territory. Ilara arrived on time, walking in with Sullivan 10 steps behind her, far enough not to be considered interference, close enough to react if he had to. She wore a white t-shirt, jeans, her hair in a ponytail, looking like any 10-year-old grabbing a drink on a weekend. But her back was straight, and her eyes swept the room before she sat, a habit she'd learned from 10 years with a man who always knew where the exits were before he knew what was on the menu. Travis was already there, waiting. And this time, he was better prepared. He brought a photo album, the leather-bound kind you buy at a thrift shop and slide pictures into, just worn enough to suggest nostalgia. Inside were photos, most pulled from social media pages of distant relatives in Ohio that Brielle had long ago lost contact with, a few landscape shots Travis had added himself to fill gaps, and exactly 2 real photos that actually included him, taken back when he'd still been in Ohio, younger, thinner, with a wider smile. He opened the album and set it on the table between them. This is your grandma's house in Ohio. He pointed to a picture of a small home he wasn't even sure was the right one, betting Ilara wouldn't remember either. Your mom grew up here. There was a big maple tree in the backyard. In the fall, the leaves turned colors you can't even imagine. He told stories, voice gentle and warm, like a guide leading a tour through memory. He talked about Ohio summers, about the restaurant where he met Brielle, about the first time he saw her smile and knew right away she was the person he wanted to be with. It was a beautiful story, almost too beautiful. Then Travis shifted. He closed the album and leaned forward, voice lowering, intimate, as if he were sharing a secret only father and daughter would understand. I want to ask you something, Ilara, and you don't have to answer if you don't want to. Ilara looked at him, waiting. Do you ever wonder what a normal life would be like? Friends who don't see your dad's name in the news? A home without men with guns at the door? Taking the bus after school instead of an armored car? Just being a regular kid, not the daughter of someone people are afraid of? Silence. Ilara didn't answer right away, and that silence was the scariest part, because Travis Mercer, the liar, the schemer, the man who looked at his own daughter and saw a dollar sign, had accidentally touched a real wound. A wound Ilara had never spoken about to anyone, not even Asher, not even Brielle, because the truth was, she had thought that way. She had lain awake at night and imagined a life where she walked to school instead of sitting in a car with a driver, where she invited friends over without making them pass through security gates, where nobody whispered when she walked by, where she was just Ilara, not the Iron Crown's daughter. She had wanted normal, wanted it enough to hurt, and Travis, with that predator instinct that was terrifying in its precision, had struck the spot without even realizing how deep he'd hit. Ilara looked down at the album on the table, her finger tracing the leather cover, and for a moment she looked smaller than she'd ever looked, small and tired and confused in a way no child should ever have to be confused. Then she lifted her head, and the eyes she fixed on Travis were no longer the eyes of a confused child. If you wanted me, why did you wait until you saw money? The question dropped between them like a stone into a still lake. Travis blinked. The smile on his mouth froze. not disappearing but stopping mid-motion, like a wax figure caught between expressions. He let out a strained laugh, just a little too high, just a little too fast. No, you misunderstand. I didn't know you were here until I saw the article. I looked for you as soon as I knew. So before the article, you didn't look. Alara said it, not as a question but as a statement, her voice flat. For 11 years you didn't look. Then you saw an article with a rich man in it, and you looked right away. Travis opened his mouth, shut it, opened it again. He pivoted to something else, talking about the future, about what they could do together, about a trip to Ohio, about the normal house he would find, about a life he painted with pretty words and promises that had never had a foundation. He didn't answer the question. Alara noted it. The meeting ended after 45 minutes. Alara shook Travis's hand politely, thanked him for the album, and walked out to the car with Sullivan. She didn't look back. On the way home, she stared out the window, silent. Sullivan watched her in the rearview mirror, saw a face he couldn't read, and decided not to ask. Back at the mansion, Alara went straight to the living room, curled into the corner of the sofa, and opened the book she'd been reading. Asher came in a few minutes later. He didn't ask, didn't look her over. He only sat at the other end of the sofa, opened his own book, and read. Father and daughter sat in silence in the living room, one book each, no words. But the other person's presence was enough. This was the language they had built over 10 years. A language that didn't need speech, only being there, only the same space, the same breathing. But Asher noticed Alara wasn't turning pages. Her eyes were on the book, but she wasn't reading. She was somewhere far away, somewhere he couldn't reach, and it killed him slowly from the inside. That night, after Alara went to bed, Brielle found Asher in the study. He stood by the window, his familiar posture, staring out at the city without seeing it. She stood beside him, shoulder to shoulder, and said what both of them had been thinking all day, but neither had dared to say out loud. What if she chooses him? What if normal sounds more tempting than everything we have? Asher didn't look at her. His eyes stayed on the horizon, where the city lights blinked like a million artificial stars. Silence stretched long enough that Brielle thought he wouldn't answer. Then he did. His voice low and slow, each word heavy as stone, each word tasting like something breaking inside him, while he held it together by pure will. Then I let her go. Brielle turned to look at him, because loving her means letting her decide, even if it destroys me. 10 years ago, Asher Kane would never have said that. 10 years ago, he solved every threat by removing it. Fast, clean, final. 10 years ago, the idea of letting go of anything that belonged to him was something he called weakness, something he called death. But 10 years with Alara had taught him what the streets of Brooklyn never could. That real strength wasn't holding on to everything. It was daring to release it when release was the right thing, even when release meant losing the only thing that kept his heart beating. Brielle didn't speak. She only rested her head on his shoulder, and they stood there in the dark, watching the city flicker, and waiting for their daughter to find the truth, waiting and trusting that 10 years of love, the quiet, patient kind, the kind that showed up every day, the kind built from off-key lullabies at night and afternoons reading without words, would be enough, or not enough. And if it wasn't enough, they would let her go, because that was what real parents did. The third meeting was scheduled for Saturday afternoon. The same cafe, the same corner table by the window, the same court-appointed supervisor sitting 2 tables away. Alara arrived 15 minutes early, not because she was excited, because last night she couldn't sleep, lying on her bed, staring at the ceiling, turning over and over the question she'd asked her mother. What if he'd really changed, and finding no answer heavy enough to keep her still. So she got up early, dressed early, climbed into the car early, and Sullivan, the quietest man in the mansion, didn't ask why. The car stopped in front of the cafe. Alara stepped out, pushed open the glass door, and knew immediately that Travis wasn't at the table. The place was nearly empty at this hour. Only a few customers scattered around. The supervisor hadn't arrived yet, and the corner table by the window sat vacant. But Alara heard a voice, familiar, confident, coming from the back of the cafe near the rear door that led out to a narrow alley, Travis's voice. She stopped in the middle of the cafe. Her first instinct was to sit and wait, polite, proper, the way she'd been taught. But her second instinct, the instinct 10 years with Asher Kane had carved into her bones, told her to listen when people didn't know you were listening, because that's when they told the truth. Alara moved quietly toward the sound, her footsteps making no noise on the wooden floor, and stopped beside the rear door that was cracked open. Travis stood in the alley, his back against the brick wall, phone pressed to his ear, and his voice was completely different. No tremble, no breaking, no tears or remorse. His voice was sharp and fast and cold. The voice of a man negotiating, the voice of a man calculating profit. Listen, I need 2 more weeks. Just 2 weeks. Everything's going the way it should. The kid's starting to wobble. The other day she asked why I waited so long to look for her, but I handled it. Next meeting, I'll push harder. Talk about normal life. Talk about the things Kane can't give her. 10-year-olds, they want normal. I know which button to press. The voice on the other end of the line. Alara couldn't make it out. Only the low, steady rumble of someone impatient, someone demanding money. Travis lowered his voice, but in the quiet alley, every word carried through the cracked door, clear enough that each syllable would carve itself into the memory of the 10-year-old standing inside and never fade. The kid doesn't matter. The money matters. Once I've got custody leverage, Kane will pay 7 figures to make this disappear. I just need the kid to say she wants to live with me. Say it in court, on record. That's it. 1 sentence. Then I take the money and I'm gone. Silence. The world stopped turning. Or maybe it kept turning and Alara simply couldn't feel it anymore, because everything inside her had just gone still. Every tremor, every question, every night, staring at the ceiling wondering what if he'd really changed. Every moment in that cafe when Travis talked about Ohio, and she pictured a house with a maple tree in a backyard. Every ache in her chest when she wanted to be normal, when she thought maybe this man could give her something the Kane mansion couldn't. All of it burned to ash in 1 sentence. The kid doesn't matter. The money matters. She stood there. She didn't cry. She didn't shake. She didn't run. A 10-year-old girl stood behind a cracked door in a West Village cafe and memorized every word with a calm no child should ever need. Calm the way she'd been calm at 11 months old, hidden in a janitor's closet. Because some people are born understanding that silence is survival, that sometimes the strongest reaction is no reaction at all. She understood now, completely, clearly, with no gray left anywhere. Travis Mercer had never wanted her. Not 11 years ago when he walked away. Not 3 weeks ago when he showed up at the gate. Not today when he brought a fake album and told stories about a maple tree. He had never looked at her and seen a daughter. He had looked at her and seen money. She was leverage, a hostage, a bargaining chip, and the normal life he'd sketched. The house without guards, the walking to school, the ordinary friends. All of it had been bait, designed precisely to press on the pain she kept buried deepest, so she would say 1 sentence in court, so he could trade that sentence for 7 figures and vanish a second time. Alara turned away. She walked from the cracked door softly, soundlessly, not rushed. She crossed the cafe, pushed through the glass door, stepped onto the sidewalk where Sullivan stood beside the car, hands in his pockets, eyes scanning the street by habit. He watched her come out 45 minutes earlier than expected. He saw her face, and something in the expression of that 10-year-old girl made Sullivan, a man who'd faced every kind of danger for 20 years, feel a chill. Not because she was crying, because she wasn't. "Take me home." Alara's voice was flat, quiet, clear, no tremble, no breaking. The voice of someone who had found the answer. And the answer hurt, but she accepted it whole, without dodging, without excuses, without pretending it didn't exist. Sullivan opened the car door without asking a single question. The car cut through the city in silence. Sullivan didn't turn on music. Alara didn't look out the window this time. She stared straight ahead, back straight, hands on her lap, and breathed. Only breathed. The car stopped at the mansion. Alara got out, walked through the gates, down the hallways, past Mrs. Hargrove, standing at the foot of the stairs with worry on her face. She couldn't hide. Past everything, and straight into the study. The door opened. Asher stood by the window with his back to her, staring out at the city. The posture Alara had seen 1,000 times. The posture of a man carrying something too heavy to sit down with. He didn't turn when he heard the door, maybe thinking it was Sullivan reporting, maybe thinking it was Brielle bringing coffee. "Dad." 1 word. Her voice was a 10-year-old's voice, but it carried the weight of someone who had aged 10 years in 15 minutes. Asher turned, And the moment he saw his daughter's face, he knew. No questions. No explanations. He read it all in her eyes. The pain, the certainty, the terrifying calm, and something beneath it all that he almost didn't dare to recognize because he didn't believe he deserved it. Choice. Ilara crossed the room. Not walking. Running. She slammed into him, both arms wrapping tight around his waist, her face pressed into his chest, pressed hard, as if she could crawl inside his ribs, into the safest place she knew in the world. "I choose you, Dad." Her voice was muffled by his shirt, but every word rang through the silent room. "I'll always choose you." Asher held his daughter. His arms closed around her, squeezing tight, so tight it felt like if he loosened even 1 millimeter, she would disappear, be pulled from him by court papers and DNA tests, and a stranger with the same blood. And the Iron Crown, the man who was never at a loss for words, never short of orders, never unsure what to say in any situation from negotiation to war, couldn't speak, not one word. For the first time in his life, he had no words, because there weren't any big enough, no sentence deep enough, no language in the world that could hold what it meant that his 10-year-old daughter, the baby who had crawled to his ankle at 11 months and changed everything, looked him in the eyes and chose him, not because of blood, not because of law, not because she had no other options, but because of 10 years of him being there, every day, every night, every nightmare, every off-key lullaby, every afternoon of silent reading, every clumsy dance in the party room, all of it stacked together, layered into a mountain, no legal paperwork, no DNA, no fake tears could shake. He only held her, and held on. In the doorway, Brielle stood there. She had followed Ilara from the moment her daughter walked down the hallway with that face, and she had stood there long enough to hear the 3 words, "I choose you, Dad." Brielle covered her mouth with her hand. Tears spilled through her fingers, hot and salty, falling without control. Not tears of sorrow, not tears of relief, though relief was part of it. These were the tears of a mother who had just watched her child be forced to grow up too fast, forced to see the ugliest truth about the man who had created her, and in the middle of all that pain, still know exactly where her heart belonged. Courtroom 7, Manhattan Family Court. Monday morning, 9 o'clock. The room was smaller than people imagined. A low ceiling, fluorescent lights tinted faintly yellow, hard wooden benches in rows, the smell of stale coffee and legal paper. No jury, no television cameras, just a judge, 2 legal teams, a 10-year-old child, and the truth about to be dragged into the open under lights that held no romance. Travis Mercer sat at the table on the left in a suit, a new suit this time, bought with the last of his borrowed money, because he knew this was his final performance, and it had to be perfect. Hair neatly combed, clean shave, hands on the table, fingers laced together, the posture of a man praying, or a man acting like he was praying so well no one could tell the difference. When his attorney invited him to speak, Travis stood and did what he did best. He performed. His voice shook in the right places. His eyes reddened at the right moments. He talked about sleepless nights, about regret that gnawed at him day after day, about a father who'd made the biggest mistake of his life and only wanted one chance, just one, to make it right. He spoke about blood rights, about the sacred bond between father and child that no one had the right to sever. He said the word love again and again, love, as if repeating it enough times would turn it into truth. And if you only looked at that moment, only listened to that voice, only watched those tears, you'd believe him. A jury would have believed him. A television audience would have believed him. The whole world would have nodded and said a biological father deserved a second chance. DNA, legal rights, emotion. Travis Mercer had every card in his hand, and he looked like he could win. Then Asher's attorney stood. No drama, no grand speech. Just a silver-haired woman in a gray suit who opened her leather briefcase and began placing on the judge's desk what Travis Mercer didn't have and never could buy. 10 years. She laid down medical records. Every routine checkup. Every vaccination. Every time Ilara caught a cold at 3 a.m. The name of the person who took her to the hospital. Asher Kane. Brielle Lawson. Asher Kane. Brielle Lawson. Repeated for 10 years without a single gap. She laid down report cards. Every parent-teacher conference, every signature, every note from a teacher. Ilara's father was always the first to arrive and the last to leave at every meeting. She laid down statements. The homeroom teacher. 3 handwritten pages, describing the cold, intimidating man who at first made the entire faculty uneasy, yet never missed a single event for his daughter, sat in the front row at every recital, and once was found building a science diorama with Alara in a school hallway at 7 in the morning because she'd forgotten to bring it. Mrs. Hargrove, 12 typed pages, telling the story from the first day, from the cleaning woman hiding a baby in a supply closet, to the Mafia boss lifting that baby into his arms, to 10 years of watching a family built from nothing. Sullivan, brief and precise like a military report, listing every threat Asher had faced to protect Alara, every night he'd stayed awake on watch, every decision that placed the child's safety above his own. A decade of presence set on the scale, across from 11 years of absence, and the scale didn't wobble. The judge turned to Travis. "Mr. Mercer," she said, voice neutral, but eyes sharp, "I have a few questions. Which school does Alara attend?" Silence. Travis blinked. "What food is she allergic to?" A longer silence. "What's her favorite book?" Silence. Each empty space weighed more than 1,000 pages. Each question he couldn't answer compressed 11 years into a few seconds. 11 years of not knowing, not caring, not being there. Travis opened his mouth, searching for something to fill the gaps, but his attorney set a hand on his arm and gave a small shake of her head. Too late. Then Asher's attorney played the recording. The sound came from a small speaker on the table. Not perfect quality. Cafe noise in the background. Wind in an alley. But every word clear. Sharp as a blade cutting through the quiet courtroom. "The kid doesn't matter. The money matters. Once I've got custody leverage, Kane will pay 7 figures to make this disappear. I just need the kid to say she wants to live with me. Say it in court. On record. That's it. 1 sentence. Then I take the money and I'm gone." The courtroom went dead silent. The kind of silence you feel on your skin. The kind of silence with weight and temperature. Ice cold. Travis turned gray, not slowly. Instantly. The blood draining from his face as if someone had pulled a plug, leaving him washed out under the fluorescent lights. His attorney stared down at the table. There was nothing left to say. The judge turned off the recording, settled back in her chair, and looked at Alara. The girl sat between Asher and Brielle, back straight, hands on her lap. The judge spoke gently, with the care she gave every child who entered her courtroom. "Alara, the court wants to hear from you. What do you want?" Alara looked at Travis, and what made everyone in the room hold their breath was that there was no hatred in her eyes, no anger, no contempt. Only sadness, deep and pure. The sadness of a child looking at the man who'd created her and seeing not a monster, but a waste. Sadness for someone who could have chosen differently and didn't. For someone who could look at his daughter's smile and see dollar signs instead of a miracle. Then she turned to Asher, and her gaze changed completely. Not sad anymore. Certain, warm, like the look she'd given him at 11 months old when she'd stared up from his feet in a hallway. That first smile, that first trust. Only now it had been forged by 10 years of proof, 10 years of presence, 10 years of him being there. "A father isn't the person who gives you DNA," Alara said, her voice carrying through the room, clear, steady as stone. "A father is the person who reads to you every night, the person who holds you through every nightmare, the person who shows up, every day, never missing a day. I already have a father." The judge studied the 10-year-old girl, then the stack of 10 years of records, then Travis Mercer with his gray face, then Asher Kane, the man who'd sat silent through the entire hearing, not saying a word, letting a decade of presence speak for him. She didn't need long. The court grants full custody to Asher Kane and Brielle Lawson. All petitions by Mr. Travis Mercer are denied. Travis rose, looked at Alara one last time. Maybe he was searching for something to say. A late apology. A final excuse. A sentence he could use to tell himself he hadn't lost completely. Alara met his eyes, calm, not hateful, not angry, only truth, bare and simple. "You had your chance." Then she turned away. Travis left through the side door, shoulders slumped, suit wrinkled, his folder hanging at his side. Out in the courthouse hallway, morning light poured through tall windows and stretched across the stone floor in long, bright bands. Brielle was walking toward Asher and Alara at the far end of the corridor when Travis stepped out from the side door and passed her. 11 years ago, Brielle would have lowered her head, avoided his eyes, folded inward, as if his presence could shrink her, crush her, turn her back into the 23-year-old girl, sobbing on the kitchen floor of an empty apartment with a swollen belly and nothing left. 6 years ago, she would have clenched her jaw and marched past him, heart hammering, hands tight, hating him with a slow burn that never went out. Today, Brielle stopped and looked him straight in the eye. He stopped too, maybe surprised. Maybe because for the first time in 11 years he actually saw her. Not past her, not as an obstacle or a tool, but as a woman standing in front of him, who was no longer the girl he'd abandoned. "You left and you didn't leave me anything," Brielle said, calm, not shaking, not bitter. "But you gave me the reason to find everything." She didn't wait for his response, because she didn't need one. She turned her back, shoulders straight, and walked down the hallway toward Asher and Alara, waiting at the end. 2 silhouettes, one tall, one small, morning light on their shoulders. Asher reached out his hand. Alara reached out hers. Brielle took both and kept walking, without looking back. Behind her, Travis Mercer stood alone in the courthouse corridor, watching the 3 of them move into the light. He'd had 11 years to walk with them. He'd chosen $47 and a folder of papers. And now, as the courthouse doors closed behind the family he'd never belonged to, Travis Mercer finally understood what Alara had understood since she was 11 months old. Family isn't something you're born into. It's something you build, day by day, night by night, choice by choice, and he'd chosen wrong at every turn. The Manhattan family court office wasn't anything special. Off-white walls dulled by age, a standard government wooden desk, the kind you'd see in any administrative building from the East Coast to the West Coast. Fluorescent lights humming softly overhead, an American flag in the corner, leaning slightly because the base wasn't even. Nothing dramatic. No background music. No audience. Just another judge, not the one from the previous hearing, younger, wearing round-framed glasses, a warm smile, and in front of her, 3 people who'd taken 10 years to reach this moment. A formal adoption isn't like the movies. There aren't long speeches. There isn't a slow-motion moment with piano. There's just paperwork. A lot of paperwork. The attorney explained every clause, every line, every signature, every place a name had to go. Brielle signed first. Her hands shook. Not from fear, but from something larger than fear. Something she couldn't name but could feel in every nerve ending. She wrote her name. Brielle Lawson. The same familiar handwriting she'd used on hundreds of cleaning invoices 10 years earlier. The same hand, the same name, but the woman behind it was entirely different. Then she cried. Not a sudden sob. The tears just started to fall, slowly, steadily, like a faucet someone forgot to turn off. She didn't try to wipe them away. She didn't try to stop. She just sat there and let them drip onto the standard government desk, onto her hands, onto the legal documents she'd just signed, while her shoulders trembled and her mouth smiled, smiling and crying at the same time, the way only someone who's waited too long can understand. These weren't sad tears. They weren't happy tears in the simple sense. They were relief, the kind that comes when the most fragile thing in your life, the thing you've held with trembling hands for 10 years, terrified the wind might steal it, terrified someone might rip it away, terrified you'd wake up one day and discover it was all a dream, finally becomes permanent. Black ink on white paper, a red seal, the law. No one could take it now. Brielle cried for 5 minutes. No one rushed her. The judge waited. The lawyers waited. Asher sat beside her in silence, one hand resting on the back of her chair, not touching her, but there, always there. Then it was Asher's turn to sign. He picked up the pen with his right hand, the hand that had done things he'd never tell Alara about, things he hoped she'd never know, the hand that had clenched, struck, held weapons, signed agreements daylight should have never seen. That hand now held a pen and signed adoption papers. Asher Kane. The handwriting sharp, neat, decisive, the way he did everything in his life. But when he set the pen down, he looked at his signature on that clean sheet and knew, with an instinct deeper than logic, that this was the most important thing he'd ever signed. Not a multi-million-dollar contract, not a territory agreement, not any document locked in the basement safe. This simple legal paper in an office with off-white walls under buzzing fluorescent lights, this was his true legacy. Alara sat between them, legs swinging because the chair was a little too high, and when the judge smiled at her and stamped the final paper with a red seal, Alara smiled. A wide, radiant smile. Fearless. The same smile she'd given Asher when she was 11 months old in that hallway 10 years earlier, when she'd looked up from his feet and met him with pure joy. 10 years. The smile hadn't changed. It was still the smile of someone who trusted completely, without conditions, without hesitation. Only now it was backed by the law. That night, the Kane estate held a celebration. Not a big party. No balloons, no banners, no outside friends. Just family. The kitchen table. Not the grand dining hall, because Alara said the kitchen felt warmer and the food tasted better when you sat close to the stove. Mrs. Hargrove brought a cake she made herself, dark chocolate, because she'd known it was Alara's favorite since she was 4, the first time she tasted dark chocolate, made a face, then ate 3 more bites anyway. She set the cake down with hands that trembled slightly, not from age, but because Mrs. Hargrove, the toughest woman in the house, the one even the guards respected from a distance, was trying to hide her tears and not doing a very good job. Sullivan gave Alara a photo album, not one bought in a store. He'd bound it himself, arranged it himself, and inside were 10 years of Alara's birthdays, 1 page per year. From the first photo of 1-year-old Alara smearing cake frosting across Asher's face, to the last one of 10-year-old Alara dragging him onto a dance floor. Sullivan stood by the table, handed the album to Alara, said exactly 3 words to congratulate her, then turned away fast, because Iron Crown's head of security didn't cry in front of people, even if his ears were red, and he walked very quickly toward the dark hallway. Alara opened the album, flipped through each page, and laughed at every photo. The people around the table watched her, Mrs. Hargrove dabbing her eyes with a napkin, the head chef hovering in the kitchen doorway pretending to check the oven while he actually stared in, 2 night shift guards stopping by to say congratulations and staying for cake, and Brielle sitting beside Asher, shoulder pressed to his, watching their daughter laugh. People who used to be staff, now an extended family. That line had blurred a long time ago, and no one could say exactly when. Asher stepped back and leaned against the kitchen wall with a cup of coffee in his hand, and looked at Alara. He watched his daughter laugh with Mrs. Hargrove, laugh as Sullivan returned from the hallway with eyes a little red he'd deny to the grave. Laugh with everyone who'd helped keep her safe for 10 years. Brielle came to stand beside him, back against the wall, shoulder to shoulder. 10 years ago, I was hiding in a supply closet, terrified you'd find us, she whispered. Asher looked at her, the corner of his mouth lifting slightly. I did find you, or rather, the kid found me. Brielle smiled, eyes wet. She knew before all of us. Knew what? He asked. That you needed us as much as we needed you. Asher didn't answer. He didn't have to. He just wrapped an arm around Brielle's shoulders, and the 2 of them stood there, leaning into each other, watching their daughter laugh in the warm yellow kitchen light. Late that night, when everyone had gone to their rooms, Asher stood at Alara's doorway, the old habit. Since she'd been in a crib, he'd always passed her room before going to his own, pausing at the door, listening to her breathe, making sure she was safe. 10 years of doing it, every night, never missing one. He looked into the room. Alara lay curled under her blanket, hair spread across the pillow. On the nightstand, the stuffed bear Travis had given her sat in the farthest corner, untouched, its fur still new. No sign it had ever been hugged or held. Beside it lay the book Asher read to her every night, open, the page corner folded where they'd stopped the night before. Brielle stepped up beside him, and they both looked in at their sleeping daughter. Some gifts are just objects, she whispered, and some gifts are 10 years of showing up. Asher looked at the folded page corner, looked at the untouched bear, and understood the difference had nothing to do with value or appearance. It was time. Patience. Thousands of nights reading until a child fell asleep. I used to think family was weakness, he said, voice low and slow, like he was speaking to himself more than to Brielle. That caring about someone makes you easy to hurt. Silence. Alara's breathing, steady in the dark room. Now I know it's the only thing that ever made me strong. Alara smiled in her sleep. Maybe she was dreaming. Maybe even in her unconscious mind she could feel them at the doorway, guarding her the way they'd guarded her for 10 years, the way they'd guard her every night from now on. Safe, certain, in a home that wasn't built from brick or steel or money, but from choice. Every day, every night, every time someone stayed when they could have left, every time someone chose love when they could have chosen indifference. That was the real foundation, and nothing could break it. And that's where the story ends. But before you scroll to the next video, I want to talk to you for a minute. Not about Asher Cain, or Iron Crown, or empires, or money. About the simplest thing in this story, and the hardest thing to do in real life, being there. Just 2 words, being there. Travis Mercer is probably sitting somewhere right now still telling himself he's the victim, that money won, that the court was biased, that Asher Cain bought the system, that everything was unfair. Because people like Travis can't accept the simplest truth, that a 10-year-old girl looked at 2 men, one who shared her blood, one who shared 10 years, and she chose the one who actually stayed. Not because of money, not because of the mansion, not because of fear, but because of every night someone read to her, every nightmare someone held her through, every morning someone was there when she opened her eyes. This story isn't about rich and poor. It isn't about DNA and adoption. It isn't about who has more rights on paper. This story is about presence. The quietest work, the least glamorous work, the kind nobody films or photographs. Waking up every day and choosing to stay. Staying when you're tired. Staying when it's hard. Staying when nobody's watching and nobody's clapping. Asher Cain used to be a man who believed control was strength and family was weakness. Then an 11-month-old baby crawled to his feet and looked up with a smile that wasn't afraid. And it changed everything. Not because she was special in some supernatural way, but because she saw what everyone else missed. Everyone looked at Asher and saw steel, saw danger, saw Iron Crown. Alara looked at him and saw someone worth smiling with, and 10 years later, when she stood in court and chose him again, it wasn't a baby's instinct anymore. It was evidence. 10 years of evidence. Every day he proved she'd been right to trust him. So I want to ask you, if you were Alara, who would you choose? Blood or history? The man who gave you a last name, or the man who gave you every day? And if you were Asher, would you have the courage to say, I'll let her decide, even if she might not choose me? Would you love someone enough to accept letting go, if letting go is what's right? And the last question, the one I kept turning over in my head after I finished writing this story. Can people really change? Or do they just need someone to believe they can? Asher didn't change because anyone forced him to. Nobody told him to become a good father. A baby simply crawled to him, smiled, and refused to leave. Sometimes that's all it takes. One person believing in you before you can believe in yourself. I want to hear you. What did this story make you feel? Have you ever met an Asher in your life? Someone the world judged wrong? Or have you been Brielle, standing up from ashes and rebuilding everything? Or maybe you're Alara right now, standing between 2 choices and wondering where your heart belongs. Share it with me in the comments. I read every comment, and I truly want to hear what's sitting deep in your heart. Because stories like this only really live when they touch someone in real life. If this story touched you, please hit like, share it with someone you think needs to hear it, and subscribe to our channel to listen to more powerful stories every day. Every like, every share helps us bring more meaningful stories to more people. And finally, I'm wishing all of you watching this video good health, a joyful life, and peace in every day ahead. Remember, sometimes the bravest thing you can do isn't to fight, it's to stay. To stay when it's hard, to stay when nobody sees, to stay in love, day after day, until your presence becomes someone's home. Thank you for being here with us today. Goodbye, and I'll see you in the next video.